Jared Richards. Hi, how are you?
I'm great. How are you going?
I am well. I am well. I have to say thank you for being here to have your voice, your story be heard by the LGBT community and beyond. So thank you for that, especially to talk about your latest project. It's a book, the Little Book of Pride Heroes, Icons of the LGBTQIA plus community. First, I I want to I want to start here. The book. How would you describe this book? Is it a coffee table book? Is it, you know, just a regular book? How would you describe the type of book that this is? Let's start there.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think a coffee table book is probably a good description, but it's a little small. So maybe, it's great if you have like a tiny little coffee table, maybe it'll fit that. Um, but yeah, or a pocket book. I think it's kind of like a bite-sized guide or an entryway into queer history and queer icons. It's definitely not intended to be a massive history or kind of a really in-depth look and canonization of queer figures. So I think that probably is impossible to do right. So yeah, it's just kind of like a nice entryway, a little bit of information on 50 figures or 52 actually, that I think are inspirational in varying ways.
It reminds me of a materialized version of social media, of like postings that you might see on socials, like you just said, like a bite-sized sort of take on a particular person. You open up a page and boom, there you go. It's beautifully illustrated by Phil Constantinos.
Yeah,
How do you I don't know how you say his last name.
Konstantin Nesso, but yeah.
Oh, better you say it than me. and, and
I mean, now I've probably got it wrong, so who knows?
and
Well, I
and
mean, no, I'm pretty sure I've got it right, but
and it features a number of LGBT individuals. I believe over 50 people like people like George Michael, Frida Kahlo, Laverne Cox, just to name three individuals. How did you how did you decide who you would feature?
oh God, it was really, really difficult. I mean, I think when you're doing something like this, there are so many important queer figures throughout history, right? And there is such a beautiful kind of tapestry of people who have come before where we are to create the world that we live in today and that are continuing to fight for a better world. And so I think like right at the start of the book, me and the publishers kind of began accepting that you're not going to be able to make a book that covers everything, and that's impossible. And without that pressure, that kind of eases things up. So, really, what we just wanted to focus on was some activists, some really popular figures, and some lesser known ones as well. So, we've got a pretty eclectic bunch of people. So, there's figures that probably everybody listening would be across, like Elliot Page, for example, or Margaret Cho, Elton John. So, kind of pop culture figures that have helped change conversations around queerness and queer identity. And then a couple of historical figures as well. So we've got like your Alan Turings, we've got Josephine Baker, um, we've got like James Baldwin, for example, and then also just some like fun people as well, like Little Nas X or Hannah Gadsby, or I think like Cara Delevingne, who I think, Cara, love her. I think she's great, but she's probably not on an equal uh, playing field when you look at somebody like Marsha P. Johnson, who's also in the book, but it's about providing that kind of range of queer figures and representation that people can get excited about.
Were there people that you left out? Were there people that were potentially on your list and they did not make this cut?
Yes, it hurts me that there's no John Waters on this. in this book. And there's so many others as well. Like, I mean, Larry Kramer doesn't feature. He's such an important figure in terms of AIDS activism. Bell Hooks doesn't feature, whose writing has kind of really shaped the way that people think about queerness and also race as well. People like Truman Capote. I'm really kind of revealing myself as probably more interested in writers, but also artists like Robert Mapplethorpe or like Sufjan Stevens, even, who's like very deeply important to me. And there's a heap of Australian figures as well that I would love to cover. There's a couple in the book, but there's so many in Australia who are really special, and I would have loved to be able to platform them, but perhaps that's for even more Pride heroes, you know?
What it, do you think there will be a sequel?
Oh, well, maybe if I pressure the publisher for a sequel, we'll see. No plans at the moment, but TBD.
Yeah, because I can see a series where you come out with a sequel to it, and then potentially even like a Queer Heroes Australia, or like getting into like specifics from different countries, that sort of thing. But what inspired you, Jared? What inspired you to want to create this book?
Well, the boring answer is that the publisher approached me. But I mean, why I was interested in the idea of it is I think that, you know, these stories or these snippets and insights into queer figures' lives are really helpful. I remember being a teenager, being like not quite 100% sure of myself and looking towards figures, whether they're just like out queer comedians that we had in Australia, like Josh Thomas was quite big in Australia at that time when I was kind of a nascent queer. And he was one of the few gay men who looked like me on Australian TV. And that was really important and powerful. And I think now that I'm a bit older, I can maybe forget about that importance, but highlighting these stories and these people who are very eclectic and diverse. And, there's people like Gilbert and George who are UK artists, a couple make kind of postmodern art and have been since the 60s. They really love Margaret Thatcher, which is not something that I identify with at all. But I think speaking to a wide variety of diverse people, whether they be, identity or whether they be beliefs, I think speaks to the openness of what queerness can be. And yeah, I don't know. I think it's just really important to educate yourself about who came before, and you can find a lot of strength in that. Yeah.
There's a word that I recently came across, maybe a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, and the word is presentism. Do you know the word?
I know the word, but I could use a reminder of its definition.
Essentially, it means taking modern day words and thinking and applying these current day words and thinking to historical events and applying them to things that happened in our past. In the introduction to this book, you say, quote, "We've taken cues from each icon on their pronouns and identity, at the time of printing, and resisted the urge to label the unlabeled or use terms that weren't common use during their day." You're talking about presentism. You're talking about not wanting to apply modern day thinking and words to things that happened in the past, which is the way it should be. So, talk to me about why it was important for you to have this quote in the introduction of this book.
That's a really good question. I think there's a tendency to kind of use our eyes to gaze back upon the past. And, what we've been talking about is this need for representation and the need to see yourself in history. And so what comes with that is somebody might look at somebody like Marsha P. Johnson, and I suppose I keep coming back to her because she's such a titan, um, and identify her as a trans woman, but that's not really a term that she used
Mm-hmm.
during her time. And I think it's important to honor that,
Mm-hmm.
both in terms of who she was at the time and her identity, but also understand that our ideas of gender and sexuality are very fluid and they're very new as well. Kind of, I mean, conventional ideas of like sexuality and gender kind of come from like the 19th century. So we've only been playing in this territory for a little while now in terms of the way that you or I or other people use language to identify what we do and what we love and what we have sex with as well. And I think I'm not a historian, I'm a journalist, but I do think there's a danger in looking back with our own eyes and kind of oversimplifying things. And I wanted the book, even though it is a bite-sized look at these people, to to kind of offer some of that complexity of gender and sexuality and of people as well, which is why I mentioned Gilbert and George. I feel like I didn't really close that loop there. But you know, there's messiness in these figures who were important, whether it be like again with Marsha, there was turbulent periods in her life, and with Gilbert and George, I don't agree with their politics at all, but I wouldn't deny that they are really important figures. And I think painting history with the brushstrokes of the present, whether that be your own politics or your own understanding of gender and sexuality, has a use, but I think in terms of what we're trying to do with the book, uh, is simplifying things. Yeah.
Hmm. The title, The Little Book of Pride Heroes. Where is there a story behind this particular title and choosing it?
Um, Not really, to be honest. Sorry, that's a bit of a bad answer, but
Make one up.
yeah, I know, right? I'm not an improviser. No, I mean, thinking about the title, though, I think what we really wanted to establish is that these people, heroes is an interesting term, right? Because we do have people in here who I do think history or queer audiences would look at as heroes. So you've got like a Billy Porter, a Jeanette Mock, or even a Frank Ocean as well. So people who have really pushed forward kind of ideas of uh, gender and sexuality, or what people who look like them can achieve. And then you have figures like Lee Bowery and Roxane Gay who've done that as well. And I don't know. I suppose with heroes, it's maybe I hope that people can look at these figures and take something from them, I suppose is the answer. Um, yeah, and maybe be inspired to look up more people as well.
So, Jared Richards, you are a cultural critic, you are a journalist, an author. You write about film, TV, queer culture, music. A cultural critic. What does that mean? What does that entail?
You sound like my mum. I mean, a cultural critic is a really vague term, and I think
It
honestly, it
sounds
just
really
makes
good, but what does it mean?
it does. It sounds much better than freelance writer, I think. No, I mean, cultural critic is somebody who looks at the silly and the profound alike and tries to analyze it and look at why it's happening. So that could be something as simple as a TikTok trend or kind of a conversation on Twitter or a meme, and dissecting its wider context and its wider cultural implications, as much as it is kind of looking at a film and seeing why it's resonating or why it's not resonating. Uh, so yeah, I mean, I think a term like that just gives you an open field to examine anything that interests you. And yeah, I don't want to be stuck in like high-low dichotomies, which I think the book also reflects as well in terms of the people that are highlighted.
Queries. Is that how you say it?
Yeah.
Queries? What is queries?
So it is a reading night that I put on here in Sydney, pretty sporadically, but I do have one coming up. And basically, I get about seven or eight queer artists. So I get performers, drag queens, comedians, screenwriters, journalists like myself to get up, musicians as well, to get up and perform something that they've written themselves for about, a couple of minutes that can or can't explore their identity. It's really up to them. Yeah, it's this like cute kind of night, a chance to hear from people who wouldn't necessarily have that audience. So kind of outside of a writers festival circuit or something so serious. It's very silly. It's very fun.
Hmm.
Yeah, it's something I really love putting on.
Hmm. Well said. Well said. You are part of the LGBT community. You mentioned earlier, questioning your sexuality when you were younger. For yourself, when did that start coming into your consciousness that you had same-sex attractions, that you maybe had an attraction to, a friend of yours, a schoolmate, that sort of thing? When did this start crystallizing for you that hey, I might be gay?
Yeah, so I think I always had an inkling or a sense of it. I remember kind of whether this is an imagined memory or real or not, but feeling very different at say age 5 or 6. And
Mm. Mm-hmm.
there's that funny thing where um, I'm actually reading RuPaul's memoir at the moment for work, and he talks about this. But uh, you know, people are quick to call you gay before you even realize that you are. So perhaps it's more obvious to outsiders than it is to you. So I definitely encountered that kind of pre teenage years when I was like 9, 7, 8, was kind of identified as like a sensitive little boy, and that being code, I suppose, and sometimes not so code. Sometimes people just calling it out. But yeah, I remember kind of like being more aware of men being attractive kind of when I was 11 or 12. And I remember being on a family holiday, and The Rules of Attraction was playing on TV, the Bret Easton Ellis adapted film from 2001. It has Ian Somerhalder and Sean William Scott from American Pie in it. And there's one particular scene, it's an imagined scene, where Ian Somerhalder's character is kind of fantasizing about hooking up with this straight man. And I was alone in the hotel room watching that. My brother and sister had gone for a walk, and my brother walked in right as that scene was happening. The rest of the film actually not that explicit, but of course he walked in at that moment, when I was very transfixed. And he later asked me if I was gay that night, and I said no because I wasn't quite ready.
Mm-hmm.
But I do remember that being a really pivotal moment for
Mm.
me.
Wow. You are an entertainment reporter at the ABC, what the Australian Broadcast Company
Corporation, close enough.
Corporation, Corporation, the ABC, not to be confused with ABC here in North America, in America.
Mm.
You're also a cultural critic. You're also part of the LGBT community. I'm interested to get your take on how you view the evolution of the LGBT community, and what it's what it was, what it is, where it might be going, because there's a lot of, now we're thinking of sexuality as, something that's fluid. I don't necessarily know if I agree with that 100% in regards to, well, it sounds, if you're Like you can be straight one day, gay the next, then bi the other. It's like, what's your take on where your background and how you see things with the evolution of the LGBT community and everything that's going on with trans rights and we where we are today? What's your take?
Hmm.
It's a
Wow,
bit of a loaded question, but
that's a very big question, but I'll do my best to answer it. I mean, I think let's start with the good. Um, in the time from, I'm turning 30 this year, so I was born in 1994. And the time from me growing up and being like 10, 11, 12 in Australia, living in the outer suburbs of Sydney to now, there has been such an insurmountable difference in terms of representation and just the way that Australia views queer people. The acceptance that has been the acceptance that's there is far beyond what I grew up with. And I remember there's a line in All of Us Strangers, that film with Andrew Scott that just came out, the Andrew Hay film, where Andrew Hay's character comes out to his mum and she says like something to the effect of, "It's a hard life. I worry about you." And I remember my mum saying that. She was like, I don't have a problem with your sexuality," which not necessarily true, but I'm worried about how hard it is for you. And I think now wider culture can see that queer people can have happy, successful lives. And the only thing that's impeding that are homophobes, really. Having said that, those things I think are only true for some of the community. As you touched upon, trans people have very different experiences to what I, as like a cis white gay man living in one of the queer capitals of the world, experience. Um, yeah, it's disappointing that the rhetoric around trans people is getting increasingly violent, and it really feels like two steps forward, five steps back there. I do think that with representation and the sort of representation that comes with not my book, but I mean with the figures in my book, existing and living and breathing and speaking, um, there's more awareness of stories and hardships than there was previously in mainstream culture, which is great. Um, but yeah, the fight for equality is very unequal. And I think that is where we're at the moment. And that's definitely true in Australia as well, kind of what's happening in the US in terms of trans people being a political football, I suppose, it is happening here as well. We just kind of regurgitate what you in the UK do, unfortunately. And it's really disheartening and disgusting to see. Um, and I think that's where we're at. And in terms of your question about like fluidity and gender, um, maybe I'm kind of aligned with you that I can be like a little skeptical, just because maybe where we are and the way that we grew up, identity was more fixed. But I think it's a beautiful thing if people can identify as however they want. And I think one of the real kind of dangers of our society, or one of the big menacing premises of it, is toxic masculinity, which is a term that's overused way too much. But basically, I'm referring to men, straight, queer, whatever, who feel confined by their gender into particular roles and an expectation of success and uh, aggression and a performance of being the breadwinner that economic realities don't make possible. And so this anger lashes out at different communities who are stealing their jobs. I'm saying this in quotation marks, or taking away what's rightfully theirs, again, quotation marks. Uh, and I think if fluidity allows straight men to feel that less and feel that kind of pushing down weight less, that's a good thing because that's going to benefit everybody. Even if it like, I don't know, I think like praising a celebrity for wearing nail polish when they're a heterosexual man is like a bit overstating it, but also I think it's ultimately a net good. Sorry, that was a bit of a ramble, but I
No,
have a lot
that's
of thoughts and it's a big question.
it's a big question, and I think that, getting someone like yourself, someone who is immersed in this and has a journalistic background and can put you know put your thoughts and your words together succinctly to be able to express these things. Personally, that's what I'm looking for, as opposed to someone just talking for the sake of talking, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah, I'm same.
yeah, so with yourself and the background that you have, you said that there's the good, there's the bad in terms of how the LGBT community, how it's evolving and moving forward, and we've come so far, and you know we've certainly gained a lot. I'm going to ask you this next question about words, because for me words do matter, and the use of the word queer and the use of the word gay. And for me, I personally don't necessarily use the word queer in my everyday life. For the show, I do, of course.
Mm.
Uh, because I did an interview a few years ago with two women that were in a relationship. One was a lesbian, the other one was bisexual. And to make a long story short, one of them was on a dating app. She said that she was uh, bisexual in her profile. Changed it because she was getting flack, like get off the fence, make a decision. And she changed it to queer. And I asked her why she changed it to queer, and she said because she preferred ambiguity over persecution. She preferred ambiguity over persecution, using the word queer as opposed to bisexual. What are your thoughts on the use of the word queer and as opposed to, gay or bisexual or whatever? What are your
Mm.
thoughts?
I think that's a really sad example. Unfortunately, I think firstly, bisexual people do get a lot of flack within our community, really unfairly. But that's not really the question, but I just felt like that was worth saying.
Hmm.
Um, I personally, I use the term for myself as a gay man. There was a time where I would identify as queer, but I did think for the purposes of dating and sex, it wasn't that useful. But I've always understood queerness to be more of a worldview or a philosophy.
Or a political
And
view or something.
yes, exactly. I think when I was at university, I read Cruising Utopia by Jose Esteban Munez, which is a book about queer theory and kind of
Hmm.
what queerness could be. And, it's very academic and it's very lofty and it's very cerebral. And maybe that's not useful to everybody, but I found it very fascinating. And I think it helped me understand my sexuality is more than just who I love or who I want to fuck. And more into like a radical kind of, okay, if I'm other to what conventional society is, what can I be and what world can I live in? And I think queerness as a term signifies that. It's kind of, it doesn't have to be a rejection of capitalism or a rejection of, I don't know, liberal ideology or blah, 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 blah. But it can be those things. And I think queerness is a possibility, it's a gateway into another way of living. And whether that be something outside of monogamy or whether it be kind of like a more radical political stance, it's just an otherness. And that I really identify with and I find very powerful, particularly within art. And yeah, but I don't know. So I understand why people use it to describe themselves. And I think like I would describe myself maybe politically in those terms, but not in terms of my sexuality. But maybe on another day I might.
Jared, I have my last question for you, and it's simply this: what do you hope audiences come away with? What do you hope your audience takes away after they've read the little book of Pride Heroes? What do you hope people take away from this book?
Well, I hope they learn things that they hadn't learned before, whether that's discovering a completely new icon, which was a process that I did while kind of writing the book. There were maybe names that I was familiar with, but their stories I wasn't. Um, but I also hope that they see inspiration, I suppose, in the many ways that there are to live as a queer person and to thrive as well. Um, yeah, and that they are inspired to look elsewhere because there are important queer figures around us living right now and that have just passed that can be a real source of strength and power for us to look back on. And yeah, and I hope I've captured some of that in the book, and kind of yeah, we'll get people to look further beyond that as well.
Well said, well said. Jared Richards, thank you so much for your time. Well said, well done, well published.
Thank you, thank you.